Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us today. My name is Ashley Sullivan, and I work with the marketing team here at Wolf & Company. I'll be your host for today's webinar on social engineering, security goes beyond technology. Before I introduce today's presenter, I'd like to go over some general housekeeping items. Today's presentation will last about 45 minutes, and the slides can be downloaded at www.wolfandco.com/webinars/2012. If you have any questions at any point throughout the presentation, please send them in to me by using the questions box on the webinar's control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll have plenty of time to answer your questions at the end of the presentation. You have two options for audio today. You may dial in by phone or listen through your computer. Our audience will be muted during this session, so if you need to communicate with me at any point throughout the webinar, please use the chat box, also located on the webinar's control panel. I'd like to start by giving a brief background of the firm. Wolf & Company was established in 1911, and we are very excited to have just celebrated our 100th anniversary. Building on our tradition of unparalleled guidance, we provide our clients with assurance, tax, business consulting, and risk management services. We have over 180 professionals working for the firm and have offices in Boston and Springfield, Massachusetts, and Albany, New York. We currently employ over 45 risk management professionals excuse me, in the areas of IT assurance, internal audit, and regulatory compliance, and also Wolfpack Integrated Risk Management, and provide services to over 200 financial institutions in 19 different states and 1 U.S. territory. Now I have the pleasure of introducing today's presenter, Ryan Rodrigues, the supervisor in our IT Assurance Services Group. Thanks so much for presenting today, Ryan. I'll now hand the presentation over to you.
Great. Thanks, Ashley, and thanks, everyone, for joining today. Today's presentation, of course, is about social engineering and security awareness that can go on within your bank in order to prevent it. So we're going to break today's presentation up into 3 general areas. First, we'll describe what social engineering is and some of the threats that exist out there that could impact your institution, what your employees need to do about it at their end. Then we're going to talk about some real-life social engineering examples, some trends that are going on out in the real world. And finally, we want to wrap up by discussing some information security controls that you can implement at an organization level. So at some level, you're going to be relying on employees in order to prevent social engineering, but there are other things that you can also enforce from a centralized IT perspective. So first of all, what is social engineering? This is a term that's been around for quite some time. A lot of people haven't heard it, though. Social engineering just means that you're targeting people rather than systems. And there's a lot of ways that can be done. But it was a guy named Kevin Mitnick who really made this technique famous. He really coined the term or popularized it. What he decided is that trying to hack through a firewall or any kind of well-defended service or operating system is actually really hard. And so we found a lot more success just calling people up and asking for their credentials. And thus social engineering was born. It's obviously evolved a lot since his days, although he was very successful at it. And we see it more and more. It's starting to become one of the leading threats that we see against all institutions, and particularly targeted attacks usually involve some social engineering component. What the attacker is going to try to do is to exploit a person's desire to be helpful. That's probably the most common way that social engineering works. There are other more sort of deceitful ways of doing this, sneaking around, but oftentimes you go right up to a person, tell them that you need something in order to help you out, and they're going to want to do their job and help you out. If I pose as a customer and I have a problem, they're going to want to try and solve that problem. Unfortunately, I may not be who I say I am. And they could be giving me information that they really shouldn't. So that's where the danger of social engineering comes in. Pretexting is a huge part of social engineering. That's just putting on a scenario that's not true, pretending I'm something other than what I really am. I could pretend to be a fellow employee. I could pretend to be that person's boss if I can disguise my identity. I could pretend to be a vendor. Many different ways that pretexting is used in almost all social engineering tactics. It actually takes many different forms. We're going to get into those in the first part of this presentation. But as you can see, there's a lot of ways that a social engineer could use these tactics to bypass the controls that you implement at an IT-centric level. What good is a firewall if your employees are just going to give out credentials in order to access, remote access system? There are some things that you can do to reduce the risks or to put up more roadblocks, but at some level you will need to rely on your employees to protect you from social engineering tactics. And what that really all boils down to is security awareness. Awareness that social engineering exists. Awareness that security needs to be enforced at the employee level. It's everyone's responsibility. That's an old cliche, but it is true. Security is everyone's responsibility at any organization. The basics of security awareness is that all employees should be skeptical of all requests that they receive. Things that appear to be legitimate, they may not be, and employees need to understand that. So any request that comes in, no matter how innocuous it seems, they should have a healthy level of skepticism about it. Before they give out any information or give out any help, they should be sure of who they're dealing with. You want to verify the identity of the person on the other end of the phone or on the other computer that you're dealing with. And if they have any doubts, report it. It's the see something, say something philosophy. It's just good business for everyone to understand that. So to get into the specifics, different types of social engineering strategies that are often used. And these are by no means discrete or exclusive tactics. They're usually used in conjunction in some way or another. But farming is a very common tactic where you set up a website that looks like someone else's website, try to induce someone to input their information into it. Phishing or spear phishing is sending emails to targets, trying to get them to respond either by opening an attachment or clicking through to the URL that you link them through. There are many different ways that phishing can be used. It's almost like the spamming emails that you receive, trying to get you to transfer money. Similar philosophy, except this time we're working with information. Direct personal interaction, just use that term. That could be a face-to-face meeting or it could be on the phone. Me speaking to someone else, trying to get them to give me some type of information. Vishing and smishing, and this is where the names start to get a little obnoxious. But vishing is for phishing, except it's using voice over IP rather than email. So I can try and spoof a caller ID or something like that. And then smishing, which just sounds even worse, is SMS, it's text messaging, blasting out text messages, impersonating a legitimate entity to try to induce a response. Physical intrusion, just trying to walk into a place. Dumpster diving is trying to obtain physical information. Originally, this was literally going into dumpsters and trying to find what type of documents might have been disposed there. But you can broaden the term a little bit to in any method obtaining disposed information. Social media has become a major part of all social engineering strategies. Maybe not all, but the large majority. There's so much information contained in social media sites. It's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's LinkedIn. Almost everyone's using LinkedIn in a business environment. It's a trove of information. And as you can see, a lot of these tactics, if they're targeted in any way, particularly if it's phishing or if it's vishing or physical interaction, the more information I can get about my target, the more successful I'm likely to be. So if I can figure out what someone does on LinkedIn, what their day-to-day responsibilities are, who their direct reports are, or even things about them personally from their Facebook account, from anything that they put up in social media. If I learn that someone is away on vacation, maybe I can exploit that in some manner. So social media is just so much information out there that's often used by social engineers. The last item I have here is removable media. And this is something we call baiting. This would be leaving some type of portable media device, whether it's a USB key or a CD or any device that has a plug-and-play component to it. Leaving it out, hoping that someone's going to take that and plug it into their computer. That's just a great way to either install malware into the system or just bypass perimeter network defenses that way. Now, just because we're talking about social engineering today doesn't mean that you can completely separate it from the more technical types of attacks, just strictly hacking and vulnerabilities and penetration testing. All of those types of attacks can be done in conjunction with social engineering strategies, and they often are, in Many times the two are intertwined. And we'll get into some examples when we start talking about the real-world examples. We'll show how that's often done. But social engineering is usually involved, not usually, it's often involved with a technical attack as well, particularly a targeted persistent threat technical attack. Another thing that's important to note here as we look at all these different strategies that people can employ in some combination, it's not an all or nothing proposition when you're performing social engineering. I don't need to make one attempt and get everything on the first grab. I can get just a little bit of information when I call one employee or when I go to one person's LinkedIn site. I can then use that to enhance my understanding of the environment and develop a better targeted attack for the next person. I can call the next person, get a little bit more information, and call the next person, or any combination of these strategies. But I just want to get a little bit more every time. Just chip away at the stone until you finally reach the prize. That's often how these attacks work. Sometimes you see them go through in one attempt, but sometimes it's really a persistent targeted attack. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more detail about these specific attacks. Farming, as I mentioned, is when you set up a fake website. Spoof is what we generally call it. It will look like it's a real company's website. In most cases, you just rip the front of a website off. You get the code, you make a website that looks very much like it, and you hope that people will find their way to your website one way or another and think that it's the real deal. Okay, so if I go to mycommunitybank.com and I find everything looks appropriate, but I see that the lock that's usually in the corner of your browser is broken, that the browser detected there was some type of a certificate error, that's a good key that it could be a farming site. So what I want to do is I want people not to notice that. I want them to just try and log in using their username and password, or I want them to try and verify their credit card number, or something along those lines. Hopefully they don't pay much attention and they put that information in and submit it before they realize something's amiss. That's the goal of a farming site. Then we're going to talk about some prevention that can be done at the end user level for each one of these activities too. So as I mentioned, there are some things that you can do from a centralized IT perspective, but we really need every employee to understand these prevention techniques for the different types of social engineering. What's really important to prevent farming is to verify the SSL certificate when you go to a website. And browsers these days have gotten very good at it. It's difficult to get to a website with an invalid certificate and not notice it. The problem is that employees or any end user, even when they get the warning, they tend to do nothing about it. You just click through. There's the joke of when Internet Explorer tells you there's a problem with the website's page certificate that you're viewing. Are you sure you want to continue? Click here to continue, and then a bunch of other information that no one's ever going to read because they already clicked the first link. You have to prevent people from doing that. You have to change the mindset. When you see that page come up, something's wrong, and so at least your awareness should be peaked at that point. You should be looking for anything that's wrong and potentially contacting IT if you think that something is really a problem here. Another thing that you should do, that you should train your users to do rather, is whenever they're at a website, before they submit any sensitive information, particularly if it's a website they haven't gone to before, and even if they didn't get a warning that the certificate is invalid, take a look at the URL right in the address bar before they submit anything. You want to look at the top level domain and the domain that comes right before the top level, so something.com, something.org. That's really where certificates and web registrations are looking at. It's the last item before the .com. So sometimes what a sneaky attacker will do will be they'll add your bank's or your credit union's or your institution's name at a lower level in the URL. So it would be, say, mycommunitybank.banking.com or something like that. You're at the banking domain, not at your real bank's domain. So I can have legitimate control of that top level, and users might not notice the difference. That's something you want to train them to be aware of. Phishing is when you're using emails, and this is probably the most common social engineering tactic, but using emails to try and trick people into either giving up information or browsing to a URL or opening an attachment. There's a lot of bad things that can happen when they open that attachment. It's infected with a virus. They can get that, and it's bypassed your firewall, your perimeter defenses at that point. If it's a URL, maybe my URL links to my farming site, So those are things that phishing emails will try to do. And they can get pretty sophisticated. They can have spoofed sources, so it can look like it comes from within the organization. It can look like it comes from the person's boss or the person's friend. So you want to make sure that your users are skeptical of any email that they receive. Be very careful if something falls into your spam folder, because you might have a problem there. That's something that could indicate a problem. Know how to identify just blanket phishing attacks, things that you tend to look for like poor grammar and the classics, the Nigerian scam emails. Those things can tip you off too. Whenever you see a URL or hyperlink within your email, be careful before you click it. I can disguise the hyperlink so the text of it looks like it's going to one page, but when you hover over, the actual anchor, the link underneath it, goes somewhere entirely different. And if you're at all suspicious or you don't know the sender, just don't click any links. Don't download any files. Don't open any attachments. Just ask IT or ask someone who can verify it before you do that. Okay. Spear phishing is very similar to phishing, except this time you're targeting a few people rather than just blasting out millions of emails. So the philosophy behind phishing is that it doesn't have to be particularly good. You only need, if you send out a million emails, you only need to be smarter than one person to get someone on the hook. Spear phishing means that I have a particular target in mind. I want to specifically craft my email to go after that person. This is when I'm typically going to craft the email to look like it comes from their boss, or the content of it is going to be something that I know they happen to be working on in their job right now, so that it'll look more legitimate to them. This is difficult to detect, but users, again, they should have a healthy level of skepticism. If something doesn't seem quite right, verify with the sender. Call back a different number. Don't go through the email channel. Personal interaction. So there's not a lot that you can, again, this is if I'm either face-to-face with someone requesting information or doing it on the phone, pretending to be someone I'm not usually, or creating a situation that doesn't really exist. Employees just need to be, again, it's a healthy level of skepticism here. There's not a lot that you can do in terms of IT controls here, but make sure that employees understand you need to be clear who you're dealing with. Don't just assume that they're telling the truth of who they are. And if they ever ask for information, employees need to be clear on what the rules are about sharing information. And that could be passwords, for example. They should know that no one's ever going to ask them for their password under any circumstances. Not IT, not their boss, no one. If it's customer information that I'm asking for, they should have clear procedures on how to verify my identity and what to give me once I'm verified. Okay. Next up is phishing and smishing. The key points here are for users not to trust caller ID. That can be spoofed in voice over IP systems now, just like you could with email. You can spoof the source, same thing with the caller ID, and same thing with text messaging too. One thing to be aware of here is this is not going to target just your employees. This could target your customers as well. So make sure that there's a customer education component. But as far as your employees need to be aware, it's the same idea. Be aware of who you're talking to and verify who you're talking to. Have clear procedures on what you need to do before you disclose any information. Okay. Physical intrusion, this one's kind of fun when we test this one. It's not breaking and entering, although that is another concern. It falls a little outside the bounds of social engineering. The social engineer, on the other hand, is going to attempt to just either sneak into a secure area of the facility, or piggyback behind someone, or just dress up like the computer repair guy or the Verizon guy and just walk in. Sometimes it doesn't take that much forethought. Sometimes if you're just wearing a suit, people will let you do what you want. You just walk right past the teller line and you're into the back of the bank and no one ever challenges you along the way. So you need to make sure that your employees are identifying all the visitors, all the guests, all the customers that come into public areas. And that if they see anyone in a non-public area, they're going to challenge that party. ID badges are probably the easiest way to do that. People might not like it, but you can't always expect that they're going to recognize every employee and every new employee. They need to be able to see someone without identification and challenge that person. Now, a couple of other things to consider here. Don't leave secure equipment in unsecured areas, at least unmonitored. So if you've got a workstation that's out in the public area, make sure that people are keeping an eye on it when the operator is not sitting in front of it. Don't just leave it in the corner in an area where no one can see it, that someone could easily slip in there and try to log in through that computer. That also goes for, and this is not really in the end user's control, but it goes for network ports. If I see an open Ethernet port in a lobby area, I could plug in a wireless router or something in there to try and bypass the firewall that way, sit outside the wall trying to access. And the last thing to point out in terms of physical intrusion is it's not just a totally external party. It could be an employee who doesn't belong in a certain area, or an employee trying to access documents they don't have access to. Implement a clean desk policy and make sure that people are putting away sensitive information when it's on their desk and they're not there. Just lock it up so that everyone doesn't have access to it at all times. Dumpster diving, as I mentioned, this used to be literally sifting through garbage, but it could be any place that I can obtain a physical, whether it's paper or removable media. Me just trying to get that when someone has disposed of it incorrectly. Make sure that your employees are shredding all documents that contain sensitive information. And in this case, it's one of those situations where if you're not sure, just shred it. You know, the cost of a breach here would be way more than the cost of shredding that piece of paper. So have shred bins, lock shred bins available throughout the facilities, and make sure that, so it's convenient for employees to get to, and make sure that they are using it if there's any doubt. If there's any electronic media, make sure that they're being disposed of properly. So this would be hard drives, but it's also removable media devices like USB keys, even phones, iPhones or Droids or anything that has a hard disk on it that could store information. Make sure that those are being disposed of properly so that the drive is destroyed and it's not just left out in the open or left in the trash. I already talked about social media and how much information is on it and how common it is that social engineers use these systems. Just be very aware of what you're posting on these sites. Be aware of the site's privacy settings as well. Now, even if you think that you've implemented privacy settings in Facebook, for example, and you post something that only your friends can see, you know, if your friend responds to that post, maybe all of their friends can see it. If you put it on these sites, be very aware of how quickly it can get out, who might be seeing it. Long story short, don't post anything that you don't want the world to see. It's just the rule of thumb with social media. You might also consider implementing a social media policy for your employees to adhere to. Include it right in the acceptable use. If they're going to identify themselves in any way as an employee of your organization, they should have rules to live by in terms of what they can post for reputation purposes and for security purposes. Have people adhere to this. And the last item that I mentioned was baiting. This one also kind of fun. You can leave a flash drive or a CD or any other type of portable media in a public space and hope that one of the institution's employees will just take it and plug it in. There was a test that a company ran, it was last year or the year before, right outside of South Station in Boston. They just had people waiting on the top of the subway handing out CDs to everyone that walks by without any type of explanation. They weren't trying to fool anyone. They were just handing out CDs to see who plugged it in. And they got hundreds of responses. People just would grab it, go to work, and plug it in. So people need to know not to do that. If I were trying to be even a little bit more malicious than that, I would probably label it Executive Salaries 2010, see who plugs that in. So people need to know not to do that. They should only be using company-issued portable storage drives if that's at all a possibility for you. Anyone that might need to transfer information on these types of a jump drive or anything like that, give them one, an encrypted one. They should be scanning all files when they receive something from another person. They should be scanning all files on it for viruses and malware. That usually happens automatically, but remember it's not 100%. If it's a zero-day virus, then your antivirus won't protect against it. Plug and play also will automatically install whatever's in the device driver section of those things. So when I plug it in, the first thing you see is Windows is configuring this device for use. I could have infected the actual the boot partition there, the driver that gets installed with malware, and I could put a rootkit onto the user's PC that way. So just if you can at all do it, disable those and require employees to use company-issued ones. Again, if they see something suspicious, report it to IT. So those are some of the different areas that employees are likely to encounter in terms of social engineering. Next, I want to get to just the state of security in the real world and some examples that we're seeing out there. What we're looking at right now is just a summary from DataLossDB Of all the 2010 security incidents that were reported to them, they categorized them by type. As you can see here, we tend to think of security in terms of someone sitting in their basement surrounded by a wall of monitors and they're trying to hack through firewalls. That really only accounts for a small portion of a small portion of breaches that happen in the real world. And that's not to downplay the significance of them. It is a critical component of any IT security postures to have antivirus, to have firewall, to have patching. But when you look at actual breaches that happened out there, that only accounts for a quarter of the things that really went on. Internal fraud was another 10%. And that also includes bribery and solicitation, but that falls a little bit outside the bounds of social engineering, so we won't get into that too much. But stolen devices and documents definitely falls under social engineering. And then a big part of it, which again is not necessarily in the strictest definition of social engineering, but definitely falls under the security awareness penumbra, would be the accidental release or disclosure of information. So this is people who just lose documents. They put them in their trunk, the trunk pops open, and the documents are flying all over the highway. Or more likely, it was an unencrypted backup tape that just got lost somewhere along the line. That happens too often. That's accidental release or disclosure. Now, stolen devices, it's a similar item here, but this is a smash and grab. A laptop gets taken out of the back of a car, and that laptop is not encrypted. Again, it's an all too common occurrence. And it's easier for an attacker to do than to try and hack through your firewall, because you probably have strong IDS systems, firewall systems in place. So that's why social engineering has become so prevalent. A few examples that are happening in the real world now. Just recently, this is actually about a year ago now, so not that recent, but we did find an example. Google, and good on them, discovered an example of governmental espionage. But again, they weren't trying to hack through firewalls. What they did is they just sent emails to high-ranking political figures, but to their personal Gmail accounts, expecting that people would be conducting business on personal email rather than the government's email system. And it was a spear phishing attack. There was only a few users that they targeted, high-ranking officials, and they sent what looked like a password reset email or an account confirmation email to Gmail users. Another one that they did, it just included an attachment, and they had the standard view download link built into the Gmail structure. If there's an attachment, you'll see a little hyperlink that says view download. Well, what they did is they actually put it in the content of the email. So they had control over that view download hyperlink. And what it actually did, it took them to a Google login page, pre-populated with a username, and prompted them for a password. A lot of people entered it. Luckily, that was shut down before too much damage happened, but that's a good example of spear phishing. That happens quite frequently, not just at the government level, but for persons, individuals, consumers, and for businesses. We have a few articles from Information Week over the past year or so, just talking about the rise of social engineering over the past several years. So here we're talking about the volume of spear phishing attacks, which is what I mentioned, those really targeted, persistent threat attacks. It's peaking as of the end of last year. They're really just targeting users, like the example we just gave of the government hacking, and trying to get users to divulge their information that way and steal their passwords. So spear phishing is on the rise. Social engineering as a whole is now the leading attack vector for advanced persistent threats. APT attacks, advanced persistent threats, as opposed to simple opportunistic attacks. Someone might run a ping sweep over the whole web and find one unprotected IP. That would be an opportunistic attack. But if someone really wants to get you, social engineering is the #1 way that they're going to do it. At least a portion of it's going to be social engineering. Okay. And obviously it costs money. You can see here half of all businesses that were surveyed in this Information Week article had 25 or more successful social engineering attacks. Now, success to a varying degree. They weren't necessarily huge breaches, but things that had happened to at least trick 1 or 2 users, and these do cost a lot of money. So this, I think, is a particularly interesting article here. This is talking about the DEF CON Security Conference. This is the big hacker convention in Las Vegas every year. They have capture the flag contests where typically they'll try to hack into each other's computers and get certain bits of data. Well, they switched it up this time, or the most recent time, and they did a social engineering capture the flag. The way this worked is they picked some big companies, 14 big companies, and gave all the contestants a couple of weeks in advance to just passively obtain information. Look through their employees' LinkedIn, other social media networks. Just try and, without actually attacking them or calling them, try to gather all the information they could about these companies. And they're big companies. It's Apple, Dell, IBM, McDonald's, and Target, Verizon, a wide range. Then once they were actually at the convention and it was time for the contest to start, they were given 25 minutes, only 25 minutes to capture as many bits of data as they could from these companies. And they were worth varying amounts. It was from little things to like the name of their food service provider up to more important data like the version of their antivirus software. So every single one of the companies failed at some level. And in fact, there were only 2 employees, 2 phone calls where the employees really were suspicious and shut down the callers. So I think it's safe to say security awareness is at a pretty low level at a lot of these companies and needs to be improved. I do think it's particularly interesting because of the shift from the more technical hacking attacks towards social engineering attacks. So it plays into the articles that we were just looking at. Okay. A couple more examples. Here's one in the healthcare sector not too long ago. In this case, someone got a spear phishing email. There was only a handful of employees that received this email, but it appeared to be from what they're calling a trusted source. Details are a little bit sketchy on this one. But the email instructed employees to click on a link, which brought them to a farming site. And from there, they were asked to provide their username and password. The attackers obviously had control of the website that they were looking at, submitting that data to. So they used that username and password to obtain remote access into the healthcare systems. And thus was a breach. Okay. Here's just an article that talks about a semantics survey that was done about social engineering. And what they found here is that although overall vulnerabilities, and this is from the technical term of vulnerabilities here, internet vulnerabilities have dropped by 20% in 2011 over the previous year. So the number of vulnerable systems for hacking and for those types of attacks has gone down. But malicious attacks waged against online users, not the systems themselves, but the people that are using the internet, jumped 81% in 2011. So again, systems are getting a little bit more secure. The attackers are smartening up and going after the users instead. Now, here's probably my favorite example. This is the one that everyone I'm sure has heard of, the RSA breach that happened back at the beginning of 2011. It's a great example of what can go wrong in security, because a lot went wrong. You've probably heard about this. RSA is the leading security company. They make secure ID tokens. But someone wanted to get at their data, their product data, the data that existed within the company in order to provide security to their clients. Luckily, the attack wasn't 100% successful, but attackers did get in the environment. They did get some data that caused the scare. How did they do it? There's actually a few steps and a lot of different areas that were involved with this attack. First, it started with a spear phishing attack. The attackers gathered information on 4 specific employees. They really went after these people. Interestingly, they weren't even high-profile employees. They didn't attack the CEO or the CIO. They went after someone in accounting, a couple of people in accounting, and a couple of people in HR. And they got as much information as they could on these people from social media sites to get the information, the names, the email addresses, all of that information. Then they sent a targeted email to that person. Here's where the attack falls off a little bit. It wasn't really all that sophisticated, even though they did their homework in advance. All the email said was, I forward this file to you for a review. Please open and view it. Okay? That's it. It was that one sentence was in the email. And the employees who received it, at least one of them, they went to the spam folder, but at least one of them saw it in the spam folder, pulled it out of the spam folder and dropped it into their inbox, and then read the email. So there's a little bit of failure on a few ends here now. First of all, the employee should not have done that. The information shouldn't have been out. We're already seeing some chinks in the armor. What was attached to that email was a file called 2011 recruitmentplan.xls, something that could be of interest to accounting or HR folks. So the person opened it. What they saw was what appeared to be just a blank XLS file, nothing in it. So apparently this person decided that nothing was wrong and never reported it and never did anything about it. But it wasn't really a blank XLS. What there was a little 1 pixel by 1 pixel embedded Adobe file into it, which you didn't notice up in the top left corner. So that Adobe file was infected with malware, infected with a Trojan, a backdoor application. Unfortunately, this should have been a known vulnerability. Antivirus systems should have picked up this Trojan before it got installed. But it didn't, because the antivirus on that person's workstation was out of date. And so the backdoor got installed on that person. And all it did was passively send out data to the person who was sitting on the other end waiting to collect it on the other end. And that's how they eventually got some critical data. RSA says it didn't really break anything that was key to their systems, and I suppose we have to believe them. But this is a major problem of what's going on here. You can see several things went wrong. Security awareness training was not where it should have been. The email security system at least did its job by dropping them into the spam folder, but the user should have known better than to open it anyway. The antivirus system was not updated to detect this virus that should have been detected. It was a known application, and the Adobe Flash software was not a patched version, so that was used as the vector for actually installing the Trojan. So all these things went wrong. Any one of those doors could have been shut to prevent the attack, but that's why we talk about layered security. You want to shut every door because you never know if something else got missed along the way. So maybe you're sufficiently scared now, but we'll move on to some of the good things that you can do. Now, we already talked about what end users should be aware of when they're potentially encountering all these different types of attacks out in the wild. There's some things that you can do from an organizational standpoint in order to reduce your exposure as well. So things that can be done within the IT environment, within the HR environment as far as training. These are things that you do have control over. So we'll go through them one by one. First of all, security awareness training, I do believe, is the most important aspect to preventing social engineering. If people are aware of these attacks, how to respond to them, then the technical controls become less important. Obviously, you still need firewalls and such to prevent against technical attacks. Most social engineering attacks can be shut down or prevented from occurring in the first place by a knowledgeable and alert end user. So what you want to do as an organization is make sure that you're providing all of your employees, that's everyone, top to bottom, with a thorough and realistic security awareness training program. This should be done during onboarding and on an annual basis for everyone. Okay? I use the terms thorough and realistic. Try and tailor it to their actual day-to-day experiences, things that they're going to encounter in their real life. So they're all going to, sign the acceptable usage policy, but not everyone's necessarily going to read it. You want to sit them down and talk to them about things that they may experience, essentially the first third of this presentation, and how to handle them. So make sure that they understand why security is important, why the institution needs to rely on them in order to provide security, sort of the limits of security that can be provided by IT. You want to talk about, for each type of threat, how employees can recognize them and how to respond to them. And there's a lot more specific responsibilities, organizational policies, and things like that you'll probably want to include within the training as well. Things like password management. Don't recycle or reuse your passwords between systems so that if one gets compromised, they're all compromised. Don't share your passwords with anyone else ever under any circumstances. Don't give away customer information before you follow procedures to verify that person's identity. Those are all specific responsibilities that should be reinforced in the security awareness training as well. I put here that an in-person training session is often more effective than having some type of an online system, whether it's a recorded webinar or just a training that they need to read, a policy that they're supposed to read and sign. It may not be feasible depending on the size and the reach of your organization, but if you can, sit down your employees in a couple of groups and give them a face-to-face training on security awareness. I think you get a lot of mileage out of that, if at all possible. Lastly, for social security awareness training, keep them getting constant reminders. Send out security bulletins if there's a particular threat that's either on the horizon or that's hitting a lot of companies right now. Send out an email to your employees so that they're aware of it. One, so they could respond to it if they see it. They can recognize and respond. But also just to keep security awareness on top of their minds, so it's easy to forget. Definitely, you want to remind them the importance of security awareness at all times throughout this process. The next level of security awareness training would be actually testing them. So there may be a quiz involved with the security awareness training, but that's, in my opinion, this is somewhat limited value, quizzing them on it, because they could still easily forget it as soon as they walk out the door. Social engineering testing is a more advanced way to verify that they're really understanding what you're trying to teach them, absorbing it, and applying it in their jobs. So what we do when we do social engineering testing, you're trying to simulate real-life tactics that an attacker could use, but this time, luckily, it's obviously the tester, so the information won't be compromised. But you want to simulate the methods, at least, and gauge your employees' responses. There's a few different things that you can do for social engineering testing. Some of the most common ones here would be to send them phishing emails. Obviously, they're not real phishing emails. They're test phishing emails. But make it look like it's coming from the employee's boss or it's coming from an auditor. Ask them to give away information they shouldn't give away. See who responds with that information. Ask them to browse to a URL. People shouldn't even be clicking on links in these emails, let alone browsing to those URLs and actually inputting data. See how that works. Another thing you could do along the same lines is to conduct fraudulent customer phone calls. Call up your call center and say that you're a customer's husband or wife and that you need information for them, but you don't have their information at hand. Present some type of pretext scenario and make sure that they're following the identity verification procedures. Lastly, as far as physical security, make sure that they're identifying anyone who doesn't belong to a secure area. Send someone in who would not be recognized by the personnel at a branch or at a particular office. And send them in just wearing a suit or just wearing a uniform to say that they're working on the phone system. Make sure that someone actually challenges them, calls them out on it if they haven't been alerted by the boss or by the ISO, and actually report it to information security or to IT or the appropriate parties. So the two things that you're trying to determine here are whether they divulge the information and whether they report the incident. As you do this, usually when we do it for a first time at an institution, even if they've been given security awareness training, we tend to get a high response rate, 30% or more, the first time we do it, if people give enough information. And obviously it only takes one in some cases, so we want that number to be 0. But if you do this a few times over, people get it. Much more than just giving the training. If you do the testing and you let them know this many people failed last time, and these are things that you could have looked for to prevent it, that hits home with people much more. And we see the percentages of responses drop pretty drastically after we do it a couple of times. I see different philosophies within organizations and how they conduct this. I think it's good to use it as a learning experience for employees, at least the first couple of times you do it. So, reassure them no one's getting fired, no one's getting in trouble, but you shouldn't have done this. Here are the things that could have happened that could have gone better. That's a good way that we see it done, see it handled. Some places take it the next step, and once they have these processes in place on a regular basis, they say if you fail, one time it's a warning, but if you fail twice, we're going to start docking your bonus or something. That will definitely hit home. I'm not sure that's the best way to go about things for all institutions, but it is a possibility. Physical security, I mentioned this, but make sure that even in public areas, your employees are going to mark all the visitors that come in. They don't just get busy with customers and ignore someone that walks through the side and just bypasses security, reaches around the teller gate and unlocks it and walks right back, or anything like that. I've actually gone to the wrong building before and just walked into the back door of a bank that I was not supposed to be at and didn't realize it for a few minutes, and no one challenged me at any point in time. So make sure that people are identifying visitors, even if it's a public area. Make sure to identify all the visitors mark them, and don't let them go somewhere that they don't belong. Challenge them. I already mentioned having exposed equipment or exposed network ports that people could use. You could also consider putting screen protectors. If you've got, for example, a customer representative out on the floor in the customer area, screen protectors that will prevent someone from looking on from the side to see what they're typing in or to capture someone else's information on the screen. Certainly don't let anyone piggyback from a public area into a private area. Piggybacking would be, I have a badge or I have a proximity card and I swipe myself through the, into the secure area, but someone else is acting like they're in a hurry or they have the arms full and they just kind of butt in right behind me without letting the door close. They say, thank you for holding the door. My instinct is to hold it for them and let them in. Make sure that no one's doing that. Once you're in a secured area, have everyone wearing ID badges so it's much easier to identify any unauthorized visitor. And train your employees to actually identify and challenge those unauthorized visitors. Lastly, I talked about a clean desk policy. You do want to have that and enforce it. As far as email and internet usage policies, this is something that you do want to have. Acceptable usage policies as well, not just email and internet use, but for all systems. Have an acceptable use policy that employees sign off. Now, the extent of the restrictions can vary. Some places are a bit more draconian about what people are allowed to do on the web or on email while they're at work. And some people only want to lock down what they think are the most dangerous, darkest corners of the internet. But you do want to have a policy in place. Regardless of what your policy is, have it documented. Have people read it, understand it, sign off on it. And there's two reasons for that. One, it reduces the ambiguity of what's acceptable and what's not. People know what they can do, what they can't do. And if they decide to violate that, you have a basis for enforcing it and applying punishment to that employee if necessary. Don't rely solely on technical restrictions here. Even if you have email usage policies, you have a secure email system that can identify if an email has a social security number in it or something of that nature. You want to make sure that employees understand it, don't just rely on that system. They know when to use encrypted email solutions and how to do it manually instead of just relying on the system to automatically pick it up. They know that they're not supposed to embed, say, mortgage loan information in an image file and send that as an attachment so that it bypasses the system. So don't just rely on that. Make sure that people know what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do on the email and on the internet. Okay, so email filtering, this is more of a technical control here. But there are a lot of systems that we call them data loss prevention systems. This is one type that can detect outbound messages that have information that should not be going out. This could be because a person didn't understand the security, they didn't have time to worry about it, or they just made a mistake. But if I send out critical information like an account number or a social security number, you can build in regular expressions to these systems that will be detected, and then it can either just be encrypted and sent along automatically, or you can quarantine the email to be reviewed and released by an administrator. If you choose to quarantine it before it gets sent out, that might give you the opportunity to identify someone who is intentionally or maliciously sending out information they should not be sending out outside of the organization. So if you see that they're trying to send an Excel file just full of social security numbers and whatnot, just to some random email address, you don't want that necessarily to just be encrypted and sent along anyway. You might have the opportunity to review it and then release it. But that is also a lot of administrative overhead, so it's not entirely realistic for everyone to do that, but it is an option that you might consider. Again, you want to have the manual process in place. People should have it just on their mind to always use the manual encryption process on their email if there's ever a doubt. Don't just send it and assume that the automatic detection will work and encrypt it on the way out. Now, I warned that sometimes image files can contain sensitive information and not be detected by these systems. So again, this comes down to a matter of user training. Don't just rely on the automatic detection. Make them use the manual process every time. And lastly, employ effective spam filters. This can really help reduce the risk of phishing attacks and spear phishing attacks. If you can direct those to users' spam folders, then great. If you can prevent them from ever reaching the user's Outlook box in the first place, even better. Many times a phishing email will appear to come from within your own organization, so from within mycommunitybank.com. Good spam filters or email security systems should be able to detect that and just junk the email before it ever enters the organization. So that's something that you definitely want to have in place. Web content filtering, definitely have something in place like a WebSense system or something else along those lines that will prevent people from accessing dangerous websites. So that could be dangerous websites like, like I mentioned, those dark corners of the internet that are going to be infested with malware. But also be aware of sites that are not dangerous, that are perfectly legitimate sites, but that could incorporate methods for bypassing your other security controls. A lot of sites incorporate instant messaging and or file transfers into them. So you think about, Facebook. You think of it as a place where people's profiles are posted, and I could obtain some data about that person. But there's instant messaging built into it. Same thing with Gmail, has instant messaging built into it. You probably don't want to have that avenue open for people to let data out of the organization. Webmail sites, you also want to lock those down, because if people are able to access their Gmail or their Hotmail from work, then they could completely bypass the email security systems that you do have in place. The ones that we were just talking about. If you choose to allow webmail, even for some users, make sure those users are very well aware of their security responsibilities. Again, it's going to go back to security awareness training and trusting your employees to do the right thing if you allow webmail sites. Lastly, there are a lot of web proxy sites. The proxy allows you to bounce your web connection off of another server. From that server, hit anywhere on the internet. It's a man in the middle. You don't want them going to proxy sites because that can completely bypass any other web content filtering that you have in place. Lastly, I just put a bullet on here to just consider your usage of social media sites. Does everyone at the bank need to have access to them? Are you sure of what they're all allowing onto those sites? Or is it going to be just your marketing people, or just your sales people, or just your executives? Who's going to have access to those sites? Removable media is another key aspect of social engineering, as well as that accidental disclosure piece that we talked about, which falls a little bit outside the bounds, but still something you need to consider here. Removable media includes any type of electronic media that can store data and leave your premises. So usually we're talking about USB keys, those little drives that you can plug in, upload or download, and leave with. CDRs do still exist, and people still use CDs, sometimes CDRs or CDRWs, or DVDRs and RWs. If those are used, or if those devices even exist within your organization, regardless of whether they should be used or not, see if you can lock those down. Either don't have the hardware in the first place, or for something like USB that you really need to have, lock it down. So we call it device lockdown software. There's a lot of these out there that can do it, and some of them get pretty sophisticated in terms of recognizing approved devices versus unapproved devices, whether you can upload data and or download data to it. So you want to lock that down. Have approved devices only. Issue those approved devices to your employees, and they should be encrypted drives. Because even if you tell people not to put sensitive data onto it, there's a good chance that it's going to happen anyway. So issue them encrypted drives that should be used in all cases, and put the device lockdown software to actually prevent them from using any other systems that can either upload or download devices. I talked about how uploads from these devices can be just as dangerous to you as downloads, which could steal data. A note here on device lockdown software: it can be done within Active Directory directly. It involves actually creating some keys that you can deploy via GPO. It's not quite as elegant or easy to use or sophisticated as some of the software that you can obtain, but it is possible. If you decide you want to lock down the USB port in the BIOS, then you're also going to kill anything else that might plug into that port, like a USB mouse or USB keyboard, so you probably don't want to do that. But AD is the free option, and there are other software that can do it a little bit more elegantly. While we're on the subject, this doesn't quite fall under social engineering, but remember to encrypt any other media that could potentially leave your facilities. Laptops, mobile phones, anything that could store data and walk out of the door. Just a reminder. All right. Next up is incident response plan. What happens when you actually do have a breach? Because clearly there's a good chance that you will have a breach. Make sure that you have good incident response plans for both a computer security incident and a non-technical data privacy breach incident. Just broadly, you want to make sure that you're isolating the incident that happened, identifying all the systems or records that were affected, preserving evidence if there's a need for a forensic investigation, and then communicating with anyone that's going to be affected by it, probably your customers, any law enforcement if it escalates to that point, regulators. Make sure that people are aware of this plan, has been communicated, test it if possible, a dry walkthrough. Here's just a checklist of things that you want to have in your IRP. This slide is available if you want to go through and match up your own IRP to it, but a few things that you probably want to incorporate. Okay. Listening to your customers. This is an important aspect here. Often they're going to be the first source of alerts for phishing emails, pharming sites, or smishing messages that got sent to them. You know, your customers are sometimes targeted or stumble upon these things, and they're going to alert you. So have that open line of communication with them. Provide easy channels for them to notify you with, something right on your website about security awareness. If you see this, report it to us. Encourage them to do that. And lastly, providing security awareness education to your customers to prevent them from falling for any of these social engineering tactics. That's actually something that is required by the new FFIEC authentication guidance. You need to educate your customers on it. Another thing you can do here is implement a multi-factor authentication solution so that even if the customer's credentials do get compromised, you at least have a reduced risk that those compromised username and password will give them access to the system. You know, because there will be challenge questions or there will be a token required. Multi-factor authentication reduces the risk of that exposure pretty greatly. One thing that you're probably going to need to have is a site takedown service that you can go to when you are aware that there's a pharming site out there that's impersonating you, trying to trick your customers or your employees. There are a lot of companies that will go out and take those sites down. They can do that at the domain registration level. No one will be able to get to those sites anymore. They can kind of black hole them. FraudWatch International is the one that I see probably most often that people have had good responses for, but there are several others listed out here. You can just go to antiphishing.org, and there'll be a number of solutions listed out of companies that will do these types of services for you. So those are a lot of things that you can do from the internal side. Before we wrap this up, I just have a little bit of recommended reading here. I mentioned Kevin Mitnick at the beginning. He's kind of a good guy slash bad guy. He invented all of this before he got caught by the FBI and decided to do some good. So he has a book out there called The Art of Deception, which is really where a lot of these social engineering topics started to become popular. So it's a good read. And then more recently, he has The Art of Intrusion, which is kind of a follow-up to it, and a little bit more corporate geared. He talks about real examples of social engineering and how they could have been prevented. So both of those are good reads if you're interested in looking further into this. Otherwise, thanks for listening this afternoon, and we'll open it up to questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Ryan. If anyone has any questions, please send them in. We don't have a ton of time, so what will probably happen is Ryan will get back to you via email, but please do send your questions in now so he can reach out to you via email after this presentation. So we're just going to leave it open for about a minute or so. All right, so we don't have any questions, but feel free to take down Ryan's information. It's up on the screen right now, and reach out to him if you do have any questions at all following this presentation. I want to thank you all again for attending, and just save the date for our next webinar. It's on flood loan monitoring. Is your institution compliant? This webinar will be held on Tuesday, May 29th, and invitations will be sent out next week. Immediately following the conclusion of this webinar, you'll have the opportunity to complete a survey. As always, we appreciate your feedback so that we can continue to improve our webinar program. And as a reminder, the slides and recording of this presentation will be posted at www.wolfandco.com/webinars/2012. So feel free to listen in. I know there was a ton of information presented today. Okay, so thanks so much for joining us, everyone, and thank you, Ryan, for presenting. And we look forward to all of your participation in future webinars. Have a great afternoon, everyone.